Billionaire CEO sees old school friend fired for hiding her sick brother. Mark had built everything a man could want: an empire, a name, a life that looked perfect from the outside. But somewhere between the boardrooms and the billion-dollar deals, he'd lost something he couldn't quite name. He just knew it was gone. Then his car broke down. Not symbolically, literally. His 2026 G63 pulled to the side of the road like it had somewhere better to be, and Mark stood there, one of the wealthiest men in the state, helpless on an ordinary street. That's when he heard the shouting, a woman holding a sick boy, a boss with no patience and even less compassion. Mark watched it unfold and felt something stir in his chest. Then she turned around, and just like that, 25 years collapsed into a single second. Because he knew that face. He'd never really stopped knowing it. Josephine, he called her name excited. Nobody plans the moments that change their life. They just happen. Usually when you're not ready. Usually when you're thinking about something else entirely. Mark was thinking about a quarterly report when his G63 decided it was done for the day. No warning. No dramatic buildup. Just a subtle shudder beneath the wheel, a loss of power, and then silence. The kind of silence that feels almost deliberate. He pulled over, stepped out, and stood there for a moment. A billion-dollar man on the side of an ordinary road, completely at the mercy of something as basic as a broken engine. He almost called his driver. Almost. But there was something about the afternoon air, something about the strange stillness of the moment, that made him roll up his sleeves instead. Mark had grown up knowing how to use his hands before he ever learned how to use a boardroom. That part of him never fully left, no matter how expensive his suits got. There was a mechanic workshop nearby, small, weathered, the kind of place that had probably been there for 30 years and would quietly disappear one day without anyone writing about it. He pushed his car toward it slowly, already calculating how long the delay would cost him. He never made it to the calculation. Because before he could even announce himself, the air changed. A man's voice, sharp, impatient, the kind of voice that was used to humiliating people and had stopped feeling bad about it, cut through the afternoon. Mark slowed down without meaning to. A woman was standing in the middle of the workshop lot, holding a young boy against her side. The boy looked pale, heavy, the kind of tired that didn't come from a bad night's sleep. She was speaking quickly, trying to explain something, her voice steady but her eyes giving away every ounce of the panic she was working hard to contain. Her boss wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in making a point. Loudly, in front of everyone. Mark stood at the edge of it all and watched. He'd seen power abused in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in marriages, but there was something about watching a man tear into a woman who was clearly just trying to keep her little brother standing that settled differently. It didn't just anger him, it offended something deep and instinctive. She didn't cry. That's what struck him most. She stood there and absorbed every word with a dignity that the man yelling clearly didn't deserve to witness. When it was over, when the words, "You're fired," landed in the air between them like something physical, she simply nodded, pulled the boy a little closer, and turned around. Mark saw her face, and the quarterly report, the broken car, the entire carefully constructed afternoon, all of it fell away completely. Because he knew that face, from a lifetime ago. From a version of himself he'd almost forgotten existed. He said her name before he even decided to. Josephine. She froze. Not the kind of freeze that comes from surprise. The deeper kind. The kind where your body recognizes something before your mind fully catches up. And for just a moment, you're not entirely sure if what's happening is real. She turned back slowly, and when her eyes found his face, something moved through her expression that Mark felt more than he saw. Recognition, disbelief, and underneath both of those, something quieter, something that looked almost like relief. "Mark?" Her voice came out smaller than she probably intended. "Yeah," he said. "It's me." For a moment, neither of them moved. 25 years sat between them on that concrete lot, and somehow, neither of them knew how to cross it quickly enough. Then the boy shifted against her side, made a small sound that reminded them both that time had not actually stopped, and Josephine instinctively tightened her arm around him. That was all Mark needed to see. "We need to get him to a hospital," he said. Not a question. He was already moving toward his car, already pulling out his phone. Josephine opened her mouth, probably to protest, probably to say she was fine, probably to do the thing she'd clearly been doing for years, which was convincing people and herself that she didn't need help. "Josephine," he said her name again, quieter this time. "Let me help." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. The drive to the hospital was mostly quiet. The boy, her brother, she told him, his name was Daniel, drifted in and out of a restless half-sleep in the back seat. Josephine sat beside him, with one hand pressed gently to his forehead, her eyes never leaving his face. Mark drove and said nothing, because some moments don't need filling. But he watched her in the rearview mirror more than once. There was something about the way she held herself that was both familiar and completely new. The girl he remembered from Missouri had been bright and loud and wonderfully stubborn. This woman was quieter, more contained. Like someone who had learned to carry things without letting them show, because showing them hadn't ever made them lighter. At the hospital, nurses took Daniel quickly. Josephine stood at the edge of the waiting area and watched them wheel him through a set of doors, and for just a fraction of a second, the composure she'd been holding all afternoon slipped. Just slightly. Just enough for Mark to see it. He walked over and stood beside her. He didn't say everything was going to be fine. He didn't say anything, actually. He just stood there, close enough that she knew she wasn't alone, and let the moment be what it was. After a while, she exhaled, long and slow. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know you." She looked up at him then. Really looked. And something in her expression softened in a way that felt earned rather than easy. "Yeah," she said finally. "You do." Hospitals have a way of stripping things down to what matters. There's something about the waiting, the fluorescent lights, the low hum of machinery behind closed doors, the way minutes stretch themselves into something almost unbearable, that makes pretending feel like too much effort. People say things in hospital waiting rooms that they'd never say anywhere else. Maybe because the walls already know too many secrets. Maybe because in a place where life feels fragile, honesty feels necessary. Mark and Josephine sat beside each other and slowly, without any particular plan, began to talk. It started small. Missouri, their old neighborhood, the corner store that sold the best grape soda they'd ever tasted. The teacher they'd both been terrified of. Small, safe things that felt like testing the ground before trusting it with real weight. Then Mark said something honest without meaning to. He mentioned his ex-wife, casually the way you mention something you've rehearsed accepting. But Josephine heard the thing underneath the casualness. The exhaustion, the residual anger, the particular sadness of loving someone who turned out to be something else entirely. She tried to take everything, he said. Not bitterly, just plainly. Not because she needed it, because she could. Josephine didn't respond right away. She let the words settle where they needed to. "Did she?" she asked eventually. "The lawyers made sure she didn't," he said. "But she took something else. Something I didn't realize was gone until it had been missing for a while." He paused. "I stopped trusting people, like genuinely trusting them. I think that's when it happened." Josephine nodded slowly, not with pity, with understanding. There's a difference, and Mark felt it. Then she talked. She told him about her father passing, how it happened without enough warning, the way those things usually do, and how the morning after the funeral she'd looked around and understood that she was now the person the family leaned on. No discussion, no transition period, just a quiet, sudden shift in gravity. She talked about her mother, her health declining slowly, the way a candle burns, still giving light but unmistakably getting smaller. About Daniel, her younger brother, who was bright and funny and deserved so much more than the circumstances that kept finding him. "I don't say any of this looking for sympathy," she said clearly. It's the truth of where I've been. I know, Mark said. I'm not giving you sympathy. I'm just listening. She glanced at him sideways. A small smile appeared, brief but real. You were always good at that, she said. Even back then. Everyone else wanted to talk. You actually listened. He hadn't thought about that in years. The memory landed softly. They sat with the comfortable silence of two people who had known each other before the world got to them. And somewhere in that waiting room, between old memories and new honesty, something that had been dormant for a very long time began, quietly, to wake up. Daniel was going to be all right. The doctor confirmed it an hour later. Exhaustion, dehydration, nothing that rest and proper care wouldn't fix. Josephine closed her eyes briefly when she heard it. Just a second, just enough. Mark watched her and felt something in his chest shift. He didn't examine it. Not yet. He just noted it, filed it somewhere careful. They walked out of the hospital into the early evening, and the world outside felt strangely gentle. The kind of evening that doesn't demand anything from you. Daniel was resting, stable, and would be ready to go home by morning. Josephine had arranged for her mother's neighbor to check in on her. For the first time in what felt like a very long day, there was nothing immediate left to manage. They stood outside for a moment, neither of them quite ready to say goodbye. Mark had been thinking about it since the waiting room, turning it over carefully, examining it from different angles the way he examined every decision that actually mattered. He wasn't impulsive by nature, but he had learned, through enough expensive lessons, to trust the moments when something felt undeniably right. I want to ask you something, he said, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you respond. Josephine crossed her arms lightly. That's a very corporate opening. He almost smiled. Old habit. He paused, gathering it properly. I have an automotive business. It's been struggling for about 2 years now. Poor management, dishonest staff. I've had people in there who were more interested in what they could take than what they could build. It's not dead yet, but it's close. She listened without interrupting, with that steadiness of hers. I need someone I trust completely, he continued. Someone with integrity. Someone who won't be dazzled by the position or distracted by what they could get away with. He looked at her directly. I need you, Josephine. The evening sat quietly around them. She didn't answer immediately, and he was glad she didn't. An immediate answer would have meant she wasn't taking it seriously. The pause meant she was holding it properly, feeling its actual weight. Mark, she said eventually, I haven't run a business. I've been a mechanic's assistant and a family caretaker for the better part of a decade. I know what you've done, he said. I also know who you are. Those are two different conversations, and the second one matters more to me. She looked away for a moment, down the quiet hospital road, and there was something moving through her expression. Not doubt exactly. More like someone carefully lowering a guard they'd had up for a very long time, trying to decide if the ground beneath it was safe. What if I fail, she said quietly, not fishing for reassurance, actually asking. Then we figure it out, he said simply. But I don't think you will, and I think somewhere under all that sensible hesitation, you don't think so either. She looked back at him. Something behind her eyes made a decision. Okay, she said, quietly, firmly, the way people say things when they actually mean them. Mark nodded. No celebration, no grand moment, just two people standing in the evening air, agreeing to something that felt in a way neither of them could have fully explained. Like much more than a job offer. Not like a beginning. Josephine had never been the kind of person who needed things to be perfect before she started. She just started. That quality had carried her through enough difficult seasons that it had stopped feeling like courage and started feeling like simply who she was. So on her first Monday at the automotive business, she arrived early, made herself a cup of coffee, and began. What she found in those first few days wasn't pretty. The kind of mess that accumulates when people in positions of trust decide, slowly and then all at once, that the rules don't apply to them. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing nobody tells you about dishonesty at that scale. It rarely looks dramatic from the inside. It looks like small inconsistencies, numbers that almost add up, Invoices for work that was supposedly done but couldn't quite be accounted for. Vendors that existed on paper more convincingly than they did in reality. Josephine didn't panic. She documented. She had learned a long time ago that emotion without evidence doesn't change anything. So she moved carefully and quietly, building the picture piece by piece, cross-referencing everything, asking questions that sounded casual but weren't. She was patient in a way that people who underestimate quiet women always fail to anticipate. The staff noticed her, of course. New management always draws a certain kind of attention. Some of them were genuinely decent people who had simply survived by keeping their heads down. She recognized those ones quickly. They were the ones who made eye contact, who answered her questions without calculating first. Sorry, who seemed almost relieved that someone was finally paying attention. The others gave themselves away just as clearly, in the opposite direction. Too smooth, too helpful in the performative way that people are helpful when they're trying to manage your impression of them. Too quick to explain things she hadn't asked about yet. She kept her face neutral and her notes thorough. By the end of the third week, she had everything she needed. She called Mark. He came to the office that evening, and she laid it all out for him across the conference table. Names, dates, amounts, methods. The full architecture of how his company had been quietly hollowed out by the very people he trusted to run it. She presented it without drama, without editorializing, just the clean and devastating truth arranged in a way that couldn't be argued with. Mark was quiet for a long time after she finished. She watched him process it. The anger, the betrayal, the particular exhaustion that comes from discovering that your trust was treated as an opportunity. She recognized that exhaustion. She'd worn it herself before. How long? He asked finally. At least 18 months, she said. Probably longer. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her across the table, and something in his expression shifted. Something that went beyond gratitude or professional respect. What would you do, he asked, if it were yours? She didn't hesitate. Clean it out completely. Start with people, then systems, in that order. Then that's what we do, he said. And they did. It wasn't painless. Letting people go never is, even the ones who deserve it. There were difficult conversations, legal processes, moments where the business looked more wounded than healed. But Josephine moved through all of it with the same steady, unshakable resolve that had defined everything else she'd ever done. She hired carefully, people who wanted to build something, not extract from it. She restructured quietly and thoroughly. She stayed late not because anyone was watching, but because she genuinely cared about what they were building. And caring made the hours feel different. Within months, the company stopped bleeding. Then it stabilized. Then something remarkable happened. It started to grow. Not explosively, but meaningfully. The kind of growth that comes from a foundation that's actually solid. Mark watched it all with quiet amazement. He had hired her to save a business. He was only beginning to understand everything else she was saving in the process. There's a specific moment in every story about two people finding each other when the air between them changes. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with any particular fanfare. You usually only recognize it in hindsight, when you're looking back and trying to identify exactly when the ground shifted beneath your feet. For Mark, it was a Tuesday evening in October. They'd stayed late reviewing the quarter's numbers. Genuinely good numbers. The kind that felt almost unfamiliar after so long looking at damage. At some point, the formal part of the evening dissolved, and they'd ended up talking about everything else. The way people do when they've forgotten to keep a professional distance and don't particularly want to remember. Josephine was laughing about something. A story involving Daniel and a spectacularly failed attempt at cooking. And Mark found himself watching her more than listening. Not in a way he could easily explain. Just watching her, the way you watch something that your eyes keep returning to without permission. He looked away. But the feeling stayed. He'd spent 2 years after his divorce building very deliberate walls around that particular territory of himself. Not out of bitterness exactly, more out of self-preservation. He'd made one catastrophic miscalculation in that department, and the fallout had been expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. He wasn't in a hurry to revisit it. But Josephine wasn't a miscalculation. That was the thing his carefully constructed defenses couldn't quite argue their way around. She wasn't performing anything, wasn't positioning herself, wasn't looking at him and seeing a balance sheet with a heartbeat. She treated him with the same directness and authenticity she treated everything. Honestly, warmly, and without an agenda in sight. That for a man who had learned to scan every interaction for hidden motives was almost startling. The late evenings became a quiet habit. Sometimes they talked about the business. More often they talked about everything else. Memories from Missouri, ambitions they'd carried for years without telling anyone. The strange and winding roads their lives had taken since they last knew each other. There was an ease between them that couldn't be manufactured. It was the kind of ease that only exists between people who knew each other before they knew how to be guarded. Josephine felt it too. She'd told herself early on to be sensible about it. She was working for him. She respected him. She wasn't going to let the warmth of reconnection cloud her judgment. But respect had quietly grown into something that didn't have a clean professional category, and warmth had deepened into something that kept her thoughtful in quiet moments she didn't entirely budget for. She wasn't afraid of it. She'd carried heavier things than feelings. But she was careful with it. The way you're careful with something you don't want to damage by handling it wrong. Then one evening, Mark said something that dismantled the last of her careful distance. They'd been talking about her father. She didn't bring him up often, but when she did, something real and unguarded happened to her face. Mark had been watching it happen. And then quietly, without making it a moment, he said, "He raised someone remarkable. I hope somewhere he knows that." She didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, and in that look was everything she hadn't quite said out loud yet. Neither of them named it that evening, but they both knew. Sometimes knowing is enough for a while. Sometimes you need to just sit with the truth of something before you decide what to do with it. The business crossed a threshold that month that his financial team called extraordinary. Mark barely noticed. He was thinking about something considerably more important. He'd been planning it for 3 weeks. Not obsessively. Mark wasn't an obsessive man, but deliberately. In the same way he approached every decision that truly mattered, and with patience and intention, and an absolute certainty that when the moment came, it needed to feel exactly right. He took her back to Missouri on a Saturday. He didn't tell her exactly why. He said he had something he wanted to show her, and Josephine, who had learned by now to trust that Mark didn't do things without reason, simply said okay and got in the car. The drive was easy and comfortable the way their time together had become. Music playing low, conversation drifting in and out without effort. At some point, Josephine looked out the window and started recognizing things. The particular way the light fell across a certain stretch of road. A water tower she hadn't thought about in years. And she got very quiet. "Mark," she said slowly. "Almost there," he said. They turned onto their old street. It's past the corner store. Different name now, same building. Past the school, sitting solidly in the afternoon light as though it had been patiently waiting to be looked at again. And then he stopped the car in front of a house with a porch she knew as well as her own face. Her porch. The house she'd grown up in. She got out of the car slowly, and for a long moment just stood there taking it in. 25 years of living and losing and enduring, and this porch still looked almost exactly the same. Something in her chest did something complicated. Mark came and stood beside her, quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when something mattered enough to deserve it. "Do you remember the last day?" he said. She nodded. She remembered it clearly. She'd stood on this porch and watched his family's car disappear down the road and felt, with the uncomplicated certainty of a 10-year-old, that something important had just left her world. "I've thought about that day more times than makes any rational sense," he said. His voice was steady but unguarded in a way she'd come to recognize as the truest version of him. "I told myself it was just childhood, that you move on and you build your life, and those things become just good memories." He paused. "But I think I spent 25 years looking for something I didn't know I'd already found and lost. And I think every wrong turn, every disappointment, every road that went nowhere, I think it was all just the long way back to this street." Josephine looked at him. Her eyes were bright but steady. Anna, I'm not good at speeches, he continued. You know that. But I'm very good at knowing when something is true. And this is the truest thing I know. He reached into his pocket, got down on one knee on the same pavement where they'd once played as kids, without a single trace of self-consciousness. I don't want to do any of this without you, Josephine. Not the business, not the mornings, not any of it. You made everything better just by being exactly who you are. So I'm asking you, will you marry me? She looked at him kneeling there on their old street, in front of her childhood home, holding a ring that caught the afternoon light, and she laughed. The full, unguarded kind that starts somewhere deep and doesn't apologize for itself. Then she was crying, and still laughing. Yes, she said, firmly and without a single hesitation. Obviously, yes. He stood up and she walked into his arms, and for a long moment they just stood there on that porch, on that street, in that town that had held the beginning of them, before either of them knew there was a them to hold. Some love stories are loud and cinematic. This one had been quiet roads, hospital waiting rooms, late evenings over honest numbers, and a broken-down Mercedes on an ordinary afternoon. But the best love stories usually are. The ones built on something real never need to announce themselves. They just last. And this one was just getting started.